Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Matt Strangfeld. I am a second-year MBA student at MIT, and I'm excited to introduce the Sports Gambling Legalization of Sports panel. With us today, we have Dan Spillane, Vice President and Assistant Attorney General from the NBA, Jeff Ma from ESPN Predictive Analytics, David Purdom from ESPN Gambling Chalk website, and Ryan Ronenberg, the Assistant Professor from Florida State University. And moderating, we have Chad Millman, Editor-in-Chief of ESPN.com and ESPN the Magazine. We'll have about 45 minutes of discussion amongst the panelists and the moderator, and then we'd like to open it up to Q&A with the audience. So please submit your questions with the app, the SSAC app. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chad.
All right, thanks. So welcome to the panel. We're talking about the future of sports betting, the potential legalization of sports betting, which is a hot topic in the news. And I was doing some preparation last night in my office at ESPN for the panel, and I get Google alerts about sort of keywords for the topic of sports betting. And one of the articles that popped up yesterday was in the Washington Post. I thought it was appropriate given the topic of the panel today. It said, "Sports gambling in the U.S., too prevalent to remain illegal," which was an interesting story. And then it goes on to sort of talk about where sports betting has been and where it's going and why this is a conversation now. And then this morning I was driving up to the panel from where I live in Connecticut, and I got a call from a buddy of mine named Joe Lupo, who many, many years ago, about 15 years ago, was the bookmaker at the Stardust Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas, and I've known him for a long time. And now he's sort of a muckety-muck at the Borgata. And I hadn't spoken to Joe in a couple of years. It was just sort of coincidence that he happened to be calling me this morning, and he wanted to talk about the case in New Jersey and what's happening with the case to legalize sports betting. And one of the things he pointed out was that many, many years ago, back in 99, 2000, when he and I first met, was that John McCain, the senator from Arizona, was adamantly opposed to the idea of sports betting. And he found that to be funny because John McCain recently announced that he thought we should have hearings in Congress about the legalization of sports betting and whether or not that actually should be a good idea. So my first question for the panelists, and we'll go down from Dan to Jeff to Dave to Ryan, is how did we get here? Culturally, how did we get to a point where 15, 20 years ago, this was a non-starter, to we are now having conversations about it potentially being something that should be legal?
Sure. Speaking from a league standpoint, we have a very global business now, and we see how things are done in the rest of the world. And sports betting is legal in some form in almost 100 countries globally, and it's legal in a lot of the countries where we do business. And this is something that's been in place for a long time in some countries, is more recent in some others. But globally, this is something that's happening. It's a way that people engage with sports. It's legal, it's regulated, and that's something that we observed and that we see as happening overseas. In the US, there's some influence from that, but we've seen gambling become increasingly just more kind of part of the fabric of life in some ways. Almost every state has a lottery of some kind. More than half the states have legal casino gambling of some kind. You even see online gambling starting to take hold a little bit, with 3 states offering that now. Some others are trying, although that's going to be a political debate in this Congress coming up pretty soon. So I think we've just seen a gradual but material shift in attitudes about gambling, both in the US and overseas, which has made this an opportune time to look freshly at this issue.
Jeff.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. The only thing that I would add is that, obviously there's a lot of money that's driving this decision, because I think that, when you look at a lot of the trends that have happened in sports, I think fantasy was kind of like a gateway to a lot of this, and certainly daily fantasy has been a gateway to this. And it's the carve out that the leagues did to make fantasy, which is essentially the way that daily fantasy is. It's essentially gambling. The way that they've carved it out is kind of given them, visibility into, okay, maybe this isn't such a bad thing. But from like a cultural shift, like I think that what Dan's saying is totally true. And then I think you're seeing it, especially with online and just the internet in general, has made it really easy to get bets down, period. And so, it's one of those, it's happening anyways. And I wonder also, I think like I credit Dan and his league and Adam for being the ones that really have pushed forward on this. And And in some ways, it's almost like the Donaghy thing actually drove us to a point where we could start talking about this, and we also realize that just because it's illegal doesn't mean that game fixing can't happen. So
I'm going to go to Purdom for a second because he wrote a story for ESPN, the magazine, a cover story in which Adam Silver was on the cover. It was the gambling issue, which was out the issue before this past one. And Adam openly talked about he had been in a position where he was traveling to Europe when Donaghy happened, and it sort of opened the league's eyes. I want to follow up with that. But David, from your perspective, culturally, how do you think we got to this position we're in now?
I think the media played a big role. When I first started covering this about 6-7 years ago, if we saw a story about sports betting or point spreads on ESPN.com, it was a big thing. We're like, whoa, holy, and now we have a site dedicated to it. We've had, always the little sly mentions from Brent Musburger during broadcasts of the point spread. Everybody kind of chuckled and
I don't know
so
what
forth.
you're talking about.
Yeah, you don't know that? But now the point spread is the storyline, and the betting action is the storyline of all the big games, where it's the Super Bowl or the NCAA tournament. We dedicate whole stories to it. So I think the media acceptance of it and coverage of it has increased as well.
Ryan.
Combination of a few factors. I mean, Dan alluded to globally as also we're here in the United States. I mean, there's only 2 states where there's just no gambling at all. Utah is obviously, and Hawaii is an outlier, but it's complete opposite when it comes to sports. You have 4 states under this 1992 statute that can have some form of sports gambling, but 46 that can't. So there's just a huge gap between those two. The other main factor I've always looked at is just simply money. I mean, several need money, they need revenue, and they view this as a potential source that they can tap. I mean, that's certainly one motivation for New Jersey in trying to push this issue through the referendum and currently fighting the lawsuit that is continuing to go on.
Just for people who don't know, explain the statute you're talking about from 92.
So in 1992, Bill Bradley, ex-New York Knick, did sponsor and was the main proponent of what's called the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act. President Bush signed it in 1992. And it essentially grandfathered in Nevada, Delaware, Montana, and Oregon to have some form of sports betting. But it prohibited any other state, including New Jersey, from having sports betting after that statute got put in place. So essentially, there's a small number of states that have a monopoly for this. New Jersey is challenging that statute, at least in the original form of the lawsuit, challenging that statute that it's unconstitutional for a number of reasons to have that statute that discriminates between states on this issue of sports betting.
So, Jeff, you mentioned this, and Dan, you mentioned this as well. There's sort of a confluence of forces happening here, and Ryan touched on it. In the early 90s, there were maybe 6 states that had some form of legalized betting, not sports betting, but just any kind of betting. Generationally, we're now at a point where, as Ryan pointed out, every state has some kind of sports betting, or some kind of betting, and the internet has made betting more accessible. Since we're at an analytics conference, talk a little bit about, Jeff, you're the first person, I want you to start. Can you explain how the influence of analytics has converged with accessibility and an understanding of gambling overall to create this opportunity?
I mean, what I would say, like the role that analytics plays in this, and this is, since I'm on television kind of talking about gambling, what I've tried to do is put an analytics spin on it and kind of raise the conversation. And I think, maybe this is self-serving to think about it like this way.
You're never self-serving.
No, I try not to be, but I learn from the best.
Yeah, of course.
And the main issue, I think, is that because analytics is so at the core of gambling, that it's not just some guy from the Bronx or something like that, making bets on the street corner, right? There's this idea that you can use data and analytics and all this kind of stuff to predict what's going on in the games. And it becomes a little bit more intellectually interesting than just putting $100 down on a point spread. So I think what David's saying, and I don't necessarily agree that the media has actually helped. I think the media has lagged a lot. Like I think that what Chad has pushed through at ESPN and what ESPN's doing is great now, certainly, but I think it's been a while before, it's been a long time coming, right? I mean, the media was avoiding it for a long time and had the ability to push this forward, but they avoided it for a long time. But I think like now that we can create a narrative around it that is a little bit more highbrow rather than what I think most people think of as sort of this bookies on street corner kind of business. It does help sort of raise the conversation around it.
Dave, you look like you want to jump in with something there.
It's illegal. I mean, if we were covering it was an illegal industry from 99% of the people out there. So it was always difficult. Do I cover this? And
well, I just don't think you should give the media credit then. That's fine. I mean, I agree. Like, it's a hard thing to cover. It's a hard thing to talk about. Like in Chad and I's pod the other day, we were basically talking about like the best thing about it becoming legal around is that we can freely talk about it all of a sudden. So I agree that it's not an easy thing, but the media didn't push the forward, did it?
you don't think I gave it more exposure? You don't think that?
Recently, but that was only after Adam came out, and like I mean I give a lot of credit to Adam and the NBA for taking this progressive stance. I mean, I'm ready to go after you on a couple other things, but I'm going to give you credit for that one.
I got to say that I felt like the over/under on when you went after someone or the rails came, this thing went off the rails was about 3 questions. So
We're still on the
I
under
feel
thing.
like we were kind of under.
Yeah.
So Dan, when you were giving your answer, you talked about how this is part of the fabric of our life, right? And it's part of it's the way sports fans are enjoying and engaging with the games that they're watching. What is the NBA seeing how is that influencing the NBA when they are making decisions to come out in support of federal legislation to legalize sports betting?
Sometimes the issue is presented as, should we have sports betting in the US? And that's not the question. We have sports betting in the US. It's happening. It's a big underground industry right now. And the issue is, what should we do about that? Should we let that remain as it is, or should we bring it into the open? Should we regulate it and have it done in a way that's transparent and allows not only for the integrity of the game to be protected, you can monitor what's going on, identify people who are engaging in misconduct, but also it's a way to engage fans in a different way. We can't engage fans that are in the underground and we don't know what they're doing and what they're playing. And when it's above ground, then that's a business and an industry that we actually can engage with. And a distinct business is fantasy. It's where we've seen some of this already. We've seen that our fans are increasingly sophisticated. They like to engage with a sport in that way. There are 40 million people, I think, that have played or play fantasy games in the US, and the analytic piece of it is a huge driver. A lot of the top reason that people play fantasy games is not about winning the money, it's about the excitement. It's about the research, it's about engaging and doing your homework and bringing these analytic skills to bear in a way that allows you to engage with the sport in a different way. And that's the kind of value that we see there. And there's something similar to be said about sports betting as well.
One thing I wonder though, because so much of what drives fantasy interest, and I agree with you, it's not the money, it's the research, but it's also the social aspect of it. I wonder if gambling, which is inherently not social at all, sports betting, will you see the same engagement on that level from sports gambling than you do from fantasy?
It's an interesting question. I think it depends on how sports betting is implemented. I've always said that when it comes to the US, or at least comes to the US in a legal form, it's going to be in a form that's simple and probably social. It has to be simple because I think most Americans aren't really experienced with sports betting. There's a lot of people that are doing it already, but there's a lot of people it's going to be sort of a new phenomenon to them. And whereas if you go to the offshore sites and look at stuff that's going on overseas, a lot of it's very complicated and mysterious, I think, to a lot of people here. But the social element too, that's something that I think would have to be explored, but it's just a different way that people would be able to engage with the product. There are social ways, and this is another one.
You're jumping ahead because implementation is actually question 13.
Oh, sorry about that.
But because Ryan, can you talk a little bit about sort of what is the art of the possible here? When we talk about legalization and we talk about implementation,
Sure.
what's the reality versus what's theory?
Yeah, I mean, the overlap between analytics and the legality, is endlessly fascinating. And one aspect that the leagues I assume are looking at, and I think they could monetize and adopt and offer, is using proprietary data. You go to the research presentations here at the conference, you walk through the poster session, there's a lot of interesting analytics, and I think it's somewhat short-selling the potential and growth of legalized sports betting, like the commissioner mentioned in his New York Times op-ed. about those type of avenues that can be grown and offered by the leagues directly. I mean, that would certainly be a new and different approach. The other aspect, when you speak of transparency and how analytics can really impact this legal issue.
Brian, I'm
Sure.
curious about the data aspect of it, because I've heard you say this before.
Hold on.
But I'm curious about.
But wait a second. Let him finish. I know what you're going to ask him, and I'm going to go there.
I know what he's going to ask too. But the other aspect, when you get to transparency and integrity of the game, that's one issue that whether you're a reputable sports book, you're law enforcement, you're a sports bettor, you're a sports league, all of them agree on this. They want games on the level. They want clean games. One very important way they can do this, and this was specifically alluded to in the op-ed, is using analytics to detect and prevent match fixing and spot fixing and point shaving and whatnot. I mean, there are wonky academics like me that do this in an academic sense, but there's also private sector companies that offer these services to sports leagues. They're growing. They're used in Europe extensively. I mean, I could see North American sports leagues adopting some of those same practices very quickly. Whether it's 4 years away from complete legalization or they start adopting them now, I think that's in the not too distant future.
So Dan, I know Jeff is going to want to ask you about how you can monetize off of data. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we're the main issue that we're talking about here is like what kind of IP rights do leagues have to the actual data, and it's been in the fantasy cases and some other cases, Stats Inc., that the league doesn't have IP rights to the actual like data that comes out. What you see on television, as soon as it's on television, it's in the public domain, and they don't have rights to it. I think what you're talking about is like sport view data and things like that they basically, because they own the arenas and they own the equipment in there, they're going to have they're the only people with that data, so they have the ability to sell that and license that. But selling data and analytics, it's an interesting business in sports. Like one of my previous companies, that's what we tried to do, and it's hard to do. So I'm curious about how we see that playing out as sports gambling becomes legal. Do we create a whole new market for selling this data, and is the model creating the next Bloomberg situation, or I don't know. I'm just skeptical, I guess.
Okay. I mean, I understand your skepticism. I think you're really underestimating the power of lobbying and litigation, frankly. I mean, the precedent out there that you're alluding to, in the late 90s, the NBA was involved in a legal case against Stats and Motorola over legality of real-time data. Major League Baseball was involved in a legal case with the fantasy operator in 2007. And the leagues lost those cases. But that's not to say one element, when Congress reevaluates this, whether it's because of John McCain initiating it or one of the representatives from New Jersey, the IP rights could be one element of that. I mean, before this 1992 statute was passed, Congress had hearings on exactly that issue. PASPA was the compromise after those hearings in 1991.
Do you think that'll be a mistake? And this is when we can get into
I was going to say, let's let Dan sort of weigh in here on IP from a league perspective, and if there is an opportunity for revenue to be gained, because obviously that's one of the reasons why the leagues would be interested in this. Is it's not just because it's happening. You're a pragmatic organization that is looking to grow your business.
So it's not just altruistic.
How does the league? It's good for the public. It's good from a public relations perspective. But how does the league see itself being able to grow its business this way?
Sure. Well, I'll start by saying that the focus right now isn't on that. It's on the integrity issues. It's starting a conversation and saying, look, is there a way that this can be done in a way that protects the integrity of the game? If the answer to that question is no, then we're done with the conversation. We're not going to support anything that isn't going to be good for the game from that standpoint. And that's a commercial decision. It's an ethical one. It's one that we really believe in. It's obviously in our mission statement, but it's a business consideration as well. I mean, if our games are perceived as lacking integrity or we're perceived as having conflicts of interest, then that's going to be a bad thing for our business. But setting that aside, there are also just general commercial benefits that you could see if you had a world or a country with legalized sports betting. It's a way for fans to engage with the game. It's a way to drive interest in games. But that's all just sort of collateral. On the specific question, of license fees and whether we would be looking to participate directly in gaming revenue or profits or anything like that, we're so far away from those kinds of conversations. We've looked around the world to see how different countries do things, and there's a wide variety of approaches to that kind of issue. You have countries where It's developed so that gambling is centrally very strictly regulated, and it's kind of a one-size-fits-all approach like you would see in the UK. You have others where it's more of a contract issue between sports properties and bookmakers, like you would see in Australia, where they negotiate deals where there's licensing rights in there, and data and brand designation, information sharing, and a fee that's paid to the leagues to cover the costs of integrity efforts that the leagues engage in. France has something a little like that too. And then you have other countries where it's sort of like the federal government delegates it all to local bodies, and there aren't any fees like that. So there's a lot of different approaches, and there are a lot of different ways to skin the cat, and I don't think we've decided which of those is right and sort of what the parameters of commercial participation in this would be. The focus right now is on the integrity piece.
I feel like you have a master plan in your desk.
I have no master plan on my desk. And if I did, I wouldn't tell you about it.
So Chad, my concern on this, and I think, certainly Dan they've studied this quite a bit, and they know it probably a lot better than I do. But my concern is if the leagues start looking at this and everyone, there's going to be so many hands in this cookie jar, including the government, and it is at the end of the day that, really the answer to your question in some respects the first question should have been just money, right? Money is driving this in a lot of ways from certainly the government looking at it. But my concern is if the leagues try to charge money or try to get licensing or try to get, a piece of the handle or anything like that, because it's going to create a situation where the legal books are at a disadvantage to the illegal books, where the illegal books are able to offer better odds because they don't have to pay the licensing fees, they don't have to pay the same taxes, and professional bettors are not going to go to legal bookmakers because they're not going to get good lines. And this happened in England when they were doing it and when they were charging, and it drove everything to offshore and to illegal. And I think that's the other thing too that I'm concerned about is everyone sees these huge astronomical numbers of what online illegal gambling is, and nobody really knows what this number. You and I estimated at what, 55 trillion in the earlier?
892 trillion as of this morning.
But the idea that we're going to convert all these people to legalized gambling is just not true. So who knows how big this market really will be when it becomes legal.
So Purdom, as a guy who is talking to people who are professional bettors and using every outlet they can, to people who are on the other side of the aisle and are professional bookmakers, largely based in Nevada, how do you see a world in which sports betting is legal impacting the market as it stands?
I think there will be some substitution factor. What I mean by that is I think some of the people that are betting offshore will leave their option and go to a regulated, illegal sports book just because it is legal and they want to follow the law. I don't know that there's going to be this massive increase of sports bettors. I don't know anybody, or very few if that, of somebody that wants to bet on sports right now but says, nope, it's illegal, I'm not going to do it. It's just too easy to log on to it right now and get on a site. And that's why I think once we get to a point where we are going to legalize it, it's got to be online. We've got to have online access. It can't be a brick and mortar type thing where people have to get up, go and place a bet. And to Dan's point about the transparency of it all, you got to get that pool big enough to get that money that's offshore to the legal part of it. If we don't get that big enough pool, if the leagues do want to cut, even a small cut, it's just not going to be. It's not going to be any meaningful money unless we get this really large pool. So when they do take their cut, the bookmakers aren't run out of business and so forth because they have real small margins.
But what does it do from let's say you are a professional bettor, or you're one of the geniuses here who's got an algorithm in his backpack and he's going to move out to Vegas, or he's going to open a sports investment hedge fund or whatever it is. If this becomes legal, what does that do to that particular pool of money? What do you think that does? What are people telling you that it does to the manufacturing of point spreads, how point spreads are moving, the actual infrastructure of the business? How is that impacted?
I think the professional bettors, the last one I talked to, I asked him a pretty much specific question. He said it can't hurt. It's another opportunity. Maybe the line's a little bit different there that they can take advantage of. And maybe Jeff can speak onto this more, but I don't think that that it's going to hurt the professional gambler.
Yeah.
They still going to have their options.
I mean, you and I talked about this on the pod, and I didn't really have a good answer at that time, and I started thinking about it more since then. And I've basically come to exactly what David said, where it can't hurt. It's going to be more outs. It's going to be more opportunities. There's going to be more places to get, more outs, as we call it. So, I mean, I think it'll be a net, a positive thing, certainly for the professional gambler.
Do you think, Ron, I wonder if you have an opinion on this. How much do you think legalized betting decreases a black market of betting?
Minimal. There certainly would be some substitution effect, but given some of the convenience factors and more favorable commissions that charge, you would see some substitution. I don't think it would be great. I mean, the convenience, the professional bettor would continue to avail themselves of that option. The hypothetical that has been discussed about actually has happened. So in France, it's a cautionary tale. They adopted a licensing type of mechanism, and the then regulated, perfectly legal sportsbooks simply pulled out of the market. They're unwilling to participate. So then, it had the exact opposite effect, given the way they instituted it in that country. That lawmakers are currently revisiting the issue to consider how to bring that money back in, because when it goes outside the jurisdiction into the gray market, when government wants to regulate this, they're doing it because they want to get some tax revenue and they want to get that money coming in. The exact opposite happened.
What are some parallels? So you mentioned France. What are some parallels in the US that show what happens when we legalize an industry that had been illegal? Like, obviously, legalizing marijuana in Colorado is one example, but is that the only one that we can sort of use as a apple-to-apple comparison?
I mean, the analogy that we said, right, with the Colorado thing was that there's tons of people like standing outside of these dispensaries selling, illegal, and saying, no, you don't have to pay taxes on this, so buy with me instead. So, there is precedence of that.
That has an impact on potentially what the NBA is talking about and sort of the integrity of the game challenges. Is if you want to shine a light, if light is the disinfectant, then how do you continue to manage that if part of the market stays underground because there are challenges and sort of there are obstacles for the people who are trying to do it right from a financial perspective?
Yeah, I think there's a debate to be had about how much of the illegal market you eliminate when you legalize sports betting. I agree you aren't going to wipe it out completely, but I disagree that you're not going to affect it, or you're only going to affect it by a small amount. And in some countries, in France, there's been an issue relating to taxation. But looking at Australia is a good example here. This is a market where it's regulated, where sports properties have licensing rights and enter into agreements with bookmakers, as I said, to allow bets on their games. They have a thriving legal industry there, and anecdotally, from what we're hearing from the people who work in professional sports over there, their illegal market has really sharply reduced in size. There's an issue with offshore bookmakers, which is still a problem. As far as sort of the land-based illegal market, they say that's really been wiped out for the most part. So that's a good thing. And also, I think that's an example of a case where having sort of a licensing scheme or a different kind of regulatory scheme where it's done more capitalistic and just agreements between leagues and bookmakers can be very successful. It's a $1 billion market there. It's thriving. And so that's just another data point. It's not something we're necessarily proposing here, but I think it's relevant.
You were going to say something.
Well, I go back to this. I mean, first of all, Australia is a really difficult comp for us. I mean, there's a stat that says that 80% of Australian adults gamble in some way, shape, or form. It's different culturally. We're the Puritan country, so I mean that's not. But if you think about it, and this is like what I would say, and I've gone at you about this, and the first time we met, but. The thing that I worry about, and it's like something we traditionally do as a country that we're terrible at, is we try to regulate the crap out of something, right? And we stifle innovation in it, and we don't let that industry thrive. You think about if fantasy sports had started early on, fantasy sports started, 25, 30 years ago, and it took forever for it to get to where it is, to the point where now you're seeing those ancillary benefits as a league, where you get better brands and better sponsors and more engaged fans and all that kind of stuff. And that's the value you're going to get out of it. You have new people like Draft Day, Draft Street and whatever, Draft Kings or whatever, paying you and all that kind of stuff. That's the benefit, right? The benefit isn't necessarily day one, let's regulate this and let's get money from these people before they even know how to run their business. Like, let's let them figure out how their business is going to run and how to make money off it and build a whole new, industry. And then you guys will have 10 or 15 all of a sudden new sponsors that want to advertise with you and, newly engaged fans. And don't worry about getting money from them up front.
I'm not sure what you're proposing then. Are you saying we shouldn't regulate it?
No, I'm saying, obviously it needs to be regulated at some level, but what I'm saying is don't worry about starting to get money from people from day one, as a league, right? You know that they're going to have to pay all this money to the government and whatnot. So you guys just let it go, let them do it. You regulate it, you be part of it, you be part of it, but you let them try to effectively run their business. And then as you figure out how this business is run, then you say, okay, how are we going to monetize this? And the ways you're going to monetize it are by having more engaged fans and by having these sponsors, in the EPL, their biggest sponsors are these sports books, right? And so you're all of a sudden going to have these people that are just, these new companies that are going to be giving you tons of money. And then maybe there is the opportunity to license some of these, some of this data from a IP standpoint, because you're the only ones with cameras in the buildings. But thinking about it and saying oh, Australia is a good comp because they're, charging per handle, it's not the right way to think about it in my mind, because you're going to create a situation where the industry just is at a disadvantage to the illegal bookmakers.
Well, in Dan's defense, he said they haven't really thought about revenue in this perspective, and they're only thinking about the regulation as it relates to integrity of the game. I would ask, what kind of innovation can there be in the bookmaking industry, in the sports betting industry, if it were to become legal? We haven't actually discussed that as a panel, but it's a pretty effective market right now. So what can look different for this particular group, Brian?
No, I can think of several examples. One, and you can borrow several of these from what's going on right now in Europe, but they have these real-time exchanges where during the course of a game you can wager, sometimes big amounts, sometimes kind of micro betting that's high volume. That's something that's not familiar to people here in the States. That would certainly be a very innovative way, and when you're talking about consumption of the product and fan engagement, to have someone on their iPad live betting during the course of a game is much different than someone getting down a point spread wager before the game and then just sitting back for 2.5 hours and watching the game. That's, I think, one reason why people are so engaged with daily fantasy. Micro-level events during the course of the game, their relative chances of success go up and down during the course of the game, and it's exciting. People gravitate towards that.
Purdom, how could this be a better, more thoughtful and creative business, and how would legalization help that?
If the leagues don't take a cut, it would help. The books, they have a whole percentage of 5% on average, around there, 4 to 7%. You throw in some parlays, it goes up a lot. That 5%, you got to pay the government, you got to pay your employees. There's not a lot left over. But there does need to be some innovation, especially in Nevada, where they've kind of been slow to gravitate towards online. Several books do have it now, where it's an app, where it's in-state. So there can be those kind to help the efficiency of the business. I go back to online and about how important I think that is. Next week we have the restoration of the Wire Act is going to be read, which would, ban online gambling completely. If that happens, boy, it's going to be a tough road to make some money, for everybody to be successful with illegal sports betting.
Can you guys, Ryan, can you just set for people, we probably should have done this in the beginning.
Sure.
What is the status of, right now, New Jersey has sued the Department of Justice to overturn PASPA, which you referred to earlier on the panel. What is the status of the case right now?
Sure. So in August of 2012, the 4 major North American sports leagues, along with the NCAA, all filed suit against Governor Christie. That incarnation of the case ended in 2014 when the Supreme Court declined to hear the case. But what New Jersey did within days of losing that case, what everybody calls Christie 1, the state then decided, and Jeff alluded to this, the state then decided to simply repeal some of their prohibitions on sports betting. Now, it was a partial repeal, not a full repeal, and that's the crux of the case as it now stands before this March 17th oral argument in Philadelphia. But the state is now saying, well, if we're not allowed under this federal statute to regulate the gambling, then we're going to essentially partially deregulate gambling. And for licensed licensed casinos and racetracks in the state, they will be able to offer, if New Jersey wins, we'll be able to offer some sports betting with very limited regulation. The same 5 plaintiffs filed a second lawsuit against the state. In the first round at the district court level, the leagues won again, and I think most observers who've been following the case think it's still a long shot that New Jersey wins, but they're pressing the issue again, but on a completely different legal argument.
So what happens if the odds are long that New Jersey actually overturns PASPA? What's the conversation we're having?
Sure. If New Jersey pulls the upset, then I think the 5 plaintiffs, their lobbying infrastructure heats up very quickly, and they initiate conversations with Congress to try to get some hearings, because the leagues, at least those who have spoken publicly about it, we had the Major League Baseball commissioner yesterday said he certainly is in line with Commissioner Silver on the uniform federal regulatory structure. They would want that much more than a partial anarchy of Wild West, when individual states simply repeal their existing prohibitions, which is quite seamless and easy, rather than putting in place a regulatory framework. That means the leagues, frankly, would probably prefer the first type of regulation New Jersey was proposing back in 2011 and 2012 than what's currently being proposed. If the leagues win, then I think they have a longer time window to engage Congress in terms of these uniform federal regulatory structure where individual states can opt in. I mean, certainly Nevada would opt in before Utah would, but they would have more time to pursue that if they win, as most people expect them to.
I'm just reminding people that in about 10 minutes, we'll start taking questions from the audience, so you can start thinking about those. But let's say what is likely to happen is that New Jersey doesn't win. Is this whole conversation just sort of spinning our wheels, or does something actually change after that?
So Minnesota, South Carolina, and Indiana have pending bills to have regulated sports betting. They're letting New Jersey do a lot of the work here and incurring all the legal fees to pursue this. They're watching what happens, and their bills would have to be drastically tailored and revised, assuming New Jersey ends up losing. It would have to organically come from Congress, not from individual states trying to press the issue. Simply would take too long, would be too expensive.
So the next step, if New Jersey loses, is somehow the NBA, sort of, as it is said, finds a way, and the leagues come together and say, look, this is happening. We got to get in front of it. We got to have a conversation with Congress and say, let's find a federal law that works for a framework that regulates this.
I'd say it really isn't contingent on what's happening in the New Jersey lawsuit. Like, that process is one that we view has already begun. That was the purpose of Adam publishing his op-ed in the Times in November, was to get the ball rolling on this. And it's not just going to be the NBA in Congress lobbying, trying to do this with maybe a couple of other leagues or the other leagues all along. This is a broad coalition that would need to come together to get something happening in this area. You'd have to have the states coming, the states that want to legalize this, if they do, and a lot seem to want to do it, having their members of Congress go and support legalization. You have the gaming industry, which obviously has an interest in having this happen, that they would mobilize and be involved in this. You have a lot of other interests that might be involved in this as well. So this, Adam has taken a leadership role here in starting this conversation, but it's not just going to be us, and it's not just going to be sports leagues that are doing this. And I think this is something that the ball is already rolling on, independent of what's going on in the New Jersey lawsuit.
So, Purdom did his story with Adam for the cover of the magazine. And in it, Adam talked about that he did his op-ed at the time he did because the NBA had just done its deal with FanDuel and the daily fantasy site, and that at the same time it was opposing the lawsuit in New Jersey. And Adam had made comments previously, during the summer really, where he said, I am supporting the idea of legalizing sports betting from a federal perspective. So he felt like it was time for him to come out and so to explain to fans of the league why he was taking various positions that seemed to be on both sides of the coin. what is that conversation like? Like that day he walks in, he's like, I think I'm gonna do this op-ed. Like, are you saying to him, dude, you're crazy? Or are you like, yeah, that's a great idea? How does that, like, what is that conversation like?
This isn't something that came out of the blue in any way. This is something that we've been studying for some time. We've had, conversations with people in the gaming industry, with sports representatives from other countries where sports betting is legal. We've done a lot of homework on this issue leading up to the public positions that Adam has taken, some of the comments that he had made before his op-ed and in the op-ed itself. As far as the timing, you mentioned what he explained as his rationale for that. One of them was New Jersey. A question that comes up, or that came up and doesn't really anymore, is, well, if you are open to sports betting, then why are you trying to stop New Jersey from legalizing sports betting? Isn't that inconsistent, and isn't there tension in those positions? And as I think he explained in the op-ed, the answer to that is they're two different things. If sports betting is going to become a reality, it's a process that should unfold in Congress, not in the courts. What New Jersey is doing, in the first round, they acknowledged themselves that it was illegal. They just said it was unconstitutional and they lost. And then the current round, they're saying it's not illegal, but they're wrong about that, and the court has already ruled against them. What they're doing is illegal, and that's not the way that we believe that sports betting should start in the U.S. under a cloud of illegality with other interests that could go and challenge this. And as Ryan was mentioning, the current approach is even bad policy from a substantive standpoint because it's kind of a half-hearted regulation of sports betting. So that's why we're aligned with the other leagues in opposing what's going on in New Jersey, but at the same time, open to a discussion about what should happen at the congressional level and open to New Jersey participating in that.
How would you describe, as best you can, the position of ownership as a whole in the NBA, of the team owners on this particular topic?
This is an issue that we've briefed them on, and they're supportive of where we are on this.
Would you like to elaborate on that?
I don't know if you're looking for to run down the list of owners and who
Okay.
thinks what, but look, this is an area, which I won't do, but this is an area where they're very interested in info, and I'm not talking just about gambling, but gaming generally. And by gaming, we generally refer to that as the category that includes social games, video games, fantasy games, and then gambling is also a component of that. And the league, all the leagues are focused on this category because it's one that really is amazing for fan engagement and one that's a great commercial opportunity, and they're broadly supportive of all these efforts.
Jeff, you hobnob with Muckety Muck and owner types. When you have conversations with them, what are their conversations with you about gambling and their positions on it?
Yeah, I mean, the narrative and the attitude has definitely changed a lot in the last 10 to 15 years, where I don't think anyone is living in in a fantasy world where they don't realize that this stuff is going on, like the gambling. So I mean, I think it's just increases the value of what they own, right? If gambling is legal and there's a new industry that cares about their product, I mean, these franchises are more valuable. So I don't think anyone has a real, it's interesting to think about, and I don't. When you think about the integrity of the game and all that kind of stuff, which as a huge sports fan, I'm more concerned about than anything. There's tons of other things that are ruining the integrity of these games, and we don't want to talk about tanking, or we don't want to talk about the way the draft is structured right now, but there's lots of things that we can address along the way that create misaligned incentives. And so, in general, we need to think about, I agree that it's a concern, but certainly gambling is not necessarily the only thing that could create, improprieties or problems with misaligned incentives.
What does it look like, Protem, this is for you, in a world where it's legal and you can do it from your phone? What are the avenues in which you're able to make a bet? Sort of Ryan was talking about in-game, but beyond in-game, sort of getting as creative as possible. What are you able to actually get your money down on?
I have no answer for that. Once you get online, the number of bets that you can make, are unlimited. They have things that they call, you can bet on the first yellow card in soccer matches. And that's a lot of the times where you get into what they call spot fixing. So that may be something that we want to discuss about which types of wagers we want to have. Because if we're betting on who commits the first foul, well, that's not going to maybe have an impact on the overall game, but then you got some integrity issues going in there. So that's something I think we need to think about and consider. And Dan and I were talking a little bit about, maybe we need to limit some of the bets. Instead of going to having everything, like you said, these creative bets, maybe we need to tighten it up a little bit.
You look like you
From
want to say something.
from more of a macro level, I mean, the way sports books are structured, they do have, the traditional sports will have a stake in the outcome. Kind of on the other end of the spectrum, we have the fantasy operators, daily or traditional. I mean, they're just trying to get volume and bring people to act, and they kind of act as a facilitator in exchange. I think you're going to see more of a hybrid type of structure where traditional sports books will continue to offer the bets that they have, but they will act much more like a bet fair or an exchange, and that really lends itself to the real-time wagering, which is clearly have a foothold in Europe. I view that as what's going to be coming across the Atlantic here to the States. I mean, and that could be a type of win-win that leagues and sports books and operators could all get on board with. I mean, advertisers and broadcasters would love it. I mean, it would make live sports even more DVR-proof than they already are.
Don't they have like pop-up ads on EPL games or whatever, live odds or this, for during the games, the matches? Yeah.
Sure. I mean, and it's not, you can bet on game outcomes, of course, but goals scored and ties and micro-level events within the game. I mean, those just, the options are unlimited, but it would involve kind of a structural change in terms of how sports books are structured in terms of not having a stake in the outcome, just facilitating more of a peer-to-peer type of exchange.
So, Jeff, here's a question from the audience. I'm going to start with you. And then, Purdom, you can answer this too. Does legalizing sports betting hurt the sharps, professional bettors, the same way that legalizing drugs hurts drug cartels?
No. I mean, it's just, the
If I
analogy
had asked that question without the drugs and drug cartel part, I don't think people would have laughed, but would you have still said no?
Well, I don't like the analogy of the professional bettor
Exactly.
being the drug cartel, certainly. No, I mean, I think we covered this, which is basically like the legalized betting, I don't think hurts the sharps, because I think there's going to be more places for them to get down money, and that can only be good. And so I would think that would be a good situation. And certainly having transparency around the lines and having legitimate people running these things can only be good for the sharps also. So no, I don't think so.
I think the professional bettors are such a minority, such a small amount. We're talking, very, very few people compared to the average bet on a football game in Las Vegas right now, $20, $25, somewhere around there. You have so many, and I shouldn't say average, I mean, that's the most common size. Once you have the bigger players come in, it affects the average. But the most common size bet is $25. So it seems like if we could get all those people to give up their online book and play, or their offshore book and come play at a legal market, it would be the first step. And then are you going to bring the pro gamblers on? That's what you're going to need to get the volume so everybody can get their cut.
So the analogy really, Chad, is not in the drug cartel are the illegal bookmakers, and so the question is, how much will this eliminate illegal bookmakers? And there's a lot of aspects to betting with a bookie that are very convenient. Like one of which is most bookies allow you to bet on credit, which is like a very, very, it's a very valuable thing for a gambler, but also a very dangerous thing for a gambler, right? And so I do think that a lot of people are still going to continue to bet with their local bookie or whomever offshore situation they have.
This is a great question. I wish someone would put their name next to it. It's fantastic. Are there any issues, legal or ethical, with different parties having access to different information in sports gambling, i.e., should there be an insider trading rule for gambling? It's a great question because The analogy that people always make to the betting markets is to the financial markets. And I know Mark Cuban has come out and said there should be that the sports betting markets are actually more transparent than the financial markets, and there has been talk about creating sports betting hedge funds. That's a great question. Wow. So, Ryan, what do you think of that?
Sure, no, it is a great question. So, I mean, the analogy between insider trading and the information you can use in sports betting, the NFL injury report. I mean, the league doesn't do that just because they want to collect injury information to disseminate. I mean, it doesn't really make sense. They do that to take out a market for inside information. If they didn't publish an accurate injury report prior to the game, whether it's professional bettors or mid-level bettors, they would certainly have an incentive to bribe or somehow extort and get information from a trainer in a locker room. It'd be extremely valuable. I mean, after the 2007 Tim Donahue referee scandal, the NBA now publishes at 9 o'clock in the morning on game day who the 3 refs are. Right? That market for inside information is now gone. I mean, those type of procedural fixes at an institutional level, I mean, it's extremely important. I mean, all leagues should look at those type of fixes to take out any specter or possibility of using inside information to not just corrupt a bet, but be potentially impacting the integrity of the game. I mean, it's valuable information that people can trade off of, and they're trying to make it a commodity. So leagues can do things to alleviate that.
Dan, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, you know, when we first started having conversations with bookmakers on these issues, one of the interesting things that we realized early on is how aligned the leagues are with bookmakers on certain issues relating to the integrity of the game. The bookmakers have just as much of an interest, at least at an aggregate level, in sports having integrity and in sort of avoiding insider trading and things like that, if not more in some ways. And this is one where we've been regulating for a long time. So we have a compliance program, we have a wide range of gambling-related rules, no betting on NBA games, no fixing, and one of them is no tipping is the shorthand, but the longhand for it is that if you share confidential information for the purpose of people placing bets on NBA games or people who are not involved with betting, that's a death penalty offense. You know, you're fired, you're out of the league for life, and you know everything bad that can happen to you will happen. So we're on board with that, and I think that our interests are aligned with the bookmakers on that. But it's a great question and one that is a broader conversation than this.
Years ago, I did a story about Delaware trying to legalize sports betting in the same way that Nevada has it, and ultimately Delaware got sort of a parlay type style betting because that's what it had on the books in the 70s when it had it for one season. And I interviewed Terrell Suggs from the Baltimore Ravens about this, and I asked him, what is the fear? And he said, honestly, the fear is not players being bought to shave points or fix games. The fear from a professional perspective is the guys who are gambling, who create relationships with the guys who are third stringers making $400,000, $500,000 a year and priming them for information. It wasn't about the fixing, it was about the information. I don't have a question off of that. I just thought it was a good story.
Good point.
Yeah. Thanks,
Terrell
Appreciate that.
Suggs' fear is well grounded. It's well grounded, and whether it's an underpaid trainer, I mean, and you can extend this to one of the co-plaintiffs in the New Jersey case, the NCAA. I mean, the Adam Silver's op-ed was very carefully drafted to only apply to professional sports leagues. Kept saying professional sports league, but when you look at the NCAA angle, I mean, there's a very robust betting market for that, and not only are the trainers and the graduate assistants underpaid, I mean, the athletes themselves on the field are earning a much lower market rate than they otherwise would have in football and basketball. I mean, and when you look at the University of San Diego and Toledo and Arizona State and Northwestern basketball, I mean, you have these examples through history. I mean, that's one primary way that they started. I mean, and it's certainly a well-grounded fear that whether you're a pro athlete or college coach should have.
It's a hard question though, Chad, if you think about it, because so much of what gambling, sports gambling is about trying to get an information edge, right? It is trying to find out, like how different coaches use different players in different situations and second halves, or like understanding the impact of injuries or who might not be playing and that kind of thing. And so it is, I agree with you. It's a really good question that I'm not sure how, and I'm not sure what sort of regulation there should be put on it in terms of, if it is like the systemic issue where someone's tipping someone off and there's a whole operation around it. That's the whole reason why legalization is great, because you're going to be able to detect that at some level, right? Much easier than you could have otherwise. But if it's, someone walking down the street and seeing someone in street clothes that's supposed to be playing that day, is that a big deal?
That's a great segue to this question, which is a great follow-up to this conversation, because if the market becomes bigger and there are more people betting and information is more democratized, how would you estimate legalization would affect liquidity and efficiency? Numbers, please, exclamation point, smiley face. Jeff, I'll start with you.
I think they're kind of asking, like, would there be fewer opportunities because the market would be more efficient? Is that kind of what
Yes.
they're asking? I'm not sure. Like, I think that if we use the analogy that this market becomes more public, the general theme is that sharp action, so smart bettors, not necessarily large money or public money, moves lines and shapes the market more than the general public does. Now, there are a few games like the Super Bowl, the national championship game, where people believe those numbers move more on public action. And in those games when things are moving more on public action, there are more opportunities for the professional bettors. So the analogy or what I would say is that there may be more opportunities simply because there are a more public type of bettor now influencing the market.
The person asked specifically for numbers, and they put a smiley face there.
75.
Purdom, from your conversations with people,
From my conversation with people.
same question.
I think that I don't know how much more efficient it's going to make the market, really. It's just going to grow it. It's going to increase it. I still think the professional gamblers will have the same opportunities offshore. And if it becomes too efficient, I think there's going to be a bookmaker that's always going to be, well, I'm going to be a little bit off the market point spread. I'm going to be at 6.5 while everybody's at 7, and I'm going to attract it. I think the bookmakers may take some more risk as well.
All right, we have about 3 minutes left. I'm getting multiple versions of the same question. So in the spirit of the theme, Ryan, starting with you, what is the over-under on years until sports betting is legalized? And I guess that's part of the question, but which would you bet? Meaning, would you bet that it doesn't become legalized?
I would bet that it would get legalized, and I pegged the over-under at 4.5 years for federal level nationwide sports betting.
Why that number?
The New Jersey case has to finish, and the history has shown, when you look at the legislative history of the other gambling-related statutes that Congress has passed, whether it's UGIA in 2006, whether it's PASPA in 1992, the Wire Act in 1961, it usually takes 2 to 3 years of hearings and testimony before the final version gets passed. So 4.5 years.
David Purdom.
I'd want to ask Dan first.
Dude, he's closing.
I know, but he probably has better information. Estimates are 2 to 10 years. That's the ones I've heard. So I'll put it right in the middle, right by Ryan's, 5 years, and I'm going to take the under.
Wow.
You set the line and then took the
That's
under.
right. That's why I wanted to
That's shitty, and that's a terrible line.
strategy.
It kind of felt like he was doing everything.
I want to be at his sports book.
Let the record show that he completely waffled. He said 2 to 10, put it in 5, and said he didn't know
estimates
anything.
were 2 to 10. I was giving more of the estimates that are out there.
Yeah, I have no idea, honestly. Like these guys are the experts on this thing. If Ryan's saying 4.5 years, I believe that. I mean, I just think we've been talking about this for a long time, and it gets scary to me to think about like all the things that need to happen. But who knows? The conversation's moved a lot in the last 5 years, and who knows how far it'll move in the next 5.
Dan?
I have no number, and I don't have any special insider information on how long it's going to take. What I would say is it's going to take a long time. I think that measuring the time period in years rather than months is right. And as far as the inevitability of it, I mean, it's got to happen in the right way. I mean, I guess I'm conflating the issues of would we support it and will it happen, but I think that things are on the right track. There's a conversation that's starting on an issue that's been stale for a long time, and there hasn't really been an open public dialogue on this issue with all of the stakeholders, I think, for a while, and it's really starting now, and that's a good thing. And so I think things are moving in the right direction, but how long it's going to take, I mean, there's so many political variables that go into that it's really hard to pick a number, so I'm going to pass on that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
You hold your powder.
Yeah.
It's impressive. I think that's the end of the panel. So I want to thank Dan for coming up with these two scoundrels next to him, the legitimate league representative, and Ryan for bookending that, and Jeff and Dave for doing their thing right in the middle.